motion for this debate is this House will support military retaliation against cyber attacks. To start the debate, we call upon the first speaker of the proposition, Michelle Jimin Lee.
Madam Chair and panel, we recognize that times have changed. We recognize that war tactics have changed and technology has evolved. In spite of that, however, we recognize that cyber attacks have never received an appropriate response. We see that in past trends, they have always been responded disproportionately, ineffectively, and have never properly challenged the very detrimental idea of a cyber attack in itself. That is why, given the circumstances that there is no better alternative, that there is not enough repercussions in the status quo, we are more than proud to support a military retaliation against cyber warfare. Let's first set some parameters of this debate. What does a cyber attack look like? We think attacks, cyber attacks often involve two main stakeholders, both military and civilians, right? In the cases of civilians, we're talking about things and hacking that mess up stuff like banking systems, hospitals, or general source of electricity. We're talking about tactics like the DDoS, which is a denial service upgrade tactic, no thank you, where billions of codes are jammed into banking services that disallow it from functioning properly. We also recognize that on a second level there's a military effect, right? We're talking about stuff like cutting off communication services within the military, hacking command and controls, internet mines, stuff like that that directly threaten the national security of a nation. We think those kinds of cyber attacks are directly infringing the national security. We recognize that. Just to widen the context, we think not only are cyber attacks done by states, but we also recognize that individuals or groups like fringe groups or terrorist groups also use cyber warfare, and we also think that there's a range of sophistication within cyber warfare. So then, what does a military retaliation look like? We have 3 points of clarification. First of all, we think that necessary military responses will come after the confirmation of the perpetrator. That is, an attack occurs after investigation proved the source, and we refuse the idea that this process is too long because we think intelligence forces will be able to crack down on the perpetrators. But even if it is long, we think there's a clear necessity to carry out this attack. Second, we think we're talking about stuff like surgical attacks, where it often aim to target the roots and the infrastructure of where that cyber attack comes from. Lastly, we want to recognize that attacks are always proportional, right? We think this is an option. We recognize and we support a state's choice to carry out cyber attacks and engage them in a proportionate response. We think military commanders will be able to decide when a cyber attack is deemed necessary. Sure.
In the United States, anonymous DDoS police officers engaging police brutality. Would your side of the House support a military retaliation on the streets of America by the American military?
Again, we don't think any military commander of their own nation will want to engage in a cyber attack that will have direct consequences to its citizens. We're mostly talking about instances like Russia and Ukraine, where the international cyber warfare between two nations is infringing national security, is directly harming the civilians. Our stance on cyber opposition is simple, right? We think cyber attacks, both in principle and in impact, there's no clear difference between any traditional military attack. We think especially in the cases that cyber attacks aren't responded adequately and proportionately, that's what escalates war and accounts for an asymmetrical conflict. Also note that this debate is mostly focused on future attacks to come. We're not here to debate about the past cyber attacks that have occurred, what responses should have happened. So under that notion, I'm going to talk about 2 things. First, I'm going to talk about why principally in the changing nature of war, this is absolutely justified. Second, I'm going to talk about why this acts as a deterrence factor. Lastly, Nick is going to come up here and talk about why this decreases accidental warfare. First argument, we have 3 levels of analysis. First of all, we think war is changing. That technology has been embedded in the idea of warfare, that the frequencies of cyber warfare are increasing, but tools to combat the very idea of cyber warfare have been ineffective. Whether that be retaliating to cyber warfare using the similar tactics, we think these kinds of responses account for an endless conflict without much repercussions. We also recognize that another cyber attack often requires much time, much planning, that's not soon enough. But second, we think why in the form of cyber warfare and in its principles and in its consequences, there's not much difference in any other form of warfare. Because when we explore the direct impacts that this has to different groups of people in society, we don't think there's a difference. On a military level, we think these are things that make soldiers much more vulnerable. These are things that isolate soldiers from particular bases. You don't know what path to take if your communication line is cut off with your military general. This is a way to get troops and commanders off guard. In itself, this marks a severe threat to national security. We're talking about cutting off communication networks, GPS systems getting hacked, intelligence services being shut down. But on a civilian level, we think there are even more direct impacts to basic citizenry that often target countries' energy sources, electricity sources, like banks and financial services, through hacking and coding, like freezes assets and financial services. Like to us, not having access to our banking services may not be a detrimental impact, but to the corporations that run our very economy, not having access to your bank account is going to be a severe red alarm. It's going to have detrimental consequences. Like think about Wall Street not functioning for 3 days. We think that's going to have effects worse than the 2008 recession. But second, we're also talking about things like hospitals. Like the most vulnerable citizens are located in hospitals that depend on the country's energy sources. We give you the example of South Korea that through North Korean hacking and because hospitals like the St. Mary Hospital was shut down with this electricity because of that people were nearly died and people didn't have basic access to the services that they needed. We think backup generations in these cases are severely limited, right? So we think the end game is clear, that this is a clear infringement upon civilians and both military. That's a clear detriment upon your national security. So why is a military response necessary? We think, first of all, the practical and most obvious response, that you need an immediate response. We think cyber warfare takes way too long to plan. That's not an adequate response. But second, given the harms and impacts, we think it's a proportionate response because we told you in principle why this is no different from, let's say, an air force going over your military troops, because we think that same idea that troops are less vulnerable applies. But lastly, you cut off the root of infrastructure of these conflicts getting started because we are the ones that guarantee that there are no future cyber attacks in place. And we think this is more just of a response because responding with cyber warfare would mean that the civilians of another country would be harmed, hospital lines would be cut off, whereas military tactics would be focused on the people that perpetrated it. Second argument why this acts as a deterrence factor. We think the best way to tackle the problem that is so detrimental is to prevent it from happening. So let's look at the countries that have carried out cyber warfare. People like Putin from Russia or like North Korea. We think in all these instances, there's a reason why they're resorting to stuff like cyber warfare because and like more underhanded tactics because they don't have an intention of creating a full-out military conflict. Most leaders like Putin are opportunistically warlike. They like no repercussions being in place. They like easy wins. So we think that his character directly feeds into the idea of cyber warfare because it's underhanded and because there is no guaranteed repercussion in the status quo. We think that countries directly saying that their military is going to go after you if a cyber attack occurs massively raises the stakes for any country to launch attacks, as now there's literally a fleet of army waiting. We think that calculus that leaders make significantly changes because now people realize that the cost of a cyber attack may not be worth the risking of their security. We think that deterrence factor is a massive benefit on our side. We are more than proud to propose this.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes, 15 seconds.
To start the case of opposition, we call upon Ella Michael.
Sorry.
In the first 8 minutes of the proposition case, we basically heard a lot of reasons why cyber attacks are really bad. What we didn't hear, however, was a really good justification for using military aggression as a response to these attacks. Yes, We absolutely agree that we should respond to changing warfare and should respond to cyber attacks, but we need to hear why that response should be military aggression. Before I rebut the proposition case and introduce our first two substantive arguments on how this response is principally unjustified and actually increases conflict, let's clarify our stance in this round. Like we said, this is not a debate about whether cyber attacks are good or bad. It's about whether this House supports military aggression as a response. And we think in order to support this policy, it's inherent within the motion that it has to be both principally justified and practically beneficial. That's what the motion is asking us. We don't suggest that we stand by and do nothing. We advocate for other means of responding to cyber attacks. If it's a state actor perpetuating this attack, we advocate things like sanctions and increased cyber defense systems. These are proportional, limit escalation, and are essentially can't be construed as a declaration of war like it can be on their side of the House. But with non-state actors like criminal syndicates and terrorist groups, we think that we can just strengthen existing means of combating these groups without having a specific military campaign as a response to that attack. So, with that, let's move on into rebutting the propositions case. On framing, we would just like to point out that their characterization of what cyber attacks and military attacks look like was pretty well watered down. Cyber attacks, like they said, look like exposing information, undermining technological infrastructure. The worst example they could really come up with was undermining banking services. What does military intervention look like? They tried to gloss over this by saying that military intervention is going to be, quote, quote, surgical. What do we think that means? It is going to be a physical attack of violence on the perpetuator of this attack. Probably going to mean surgically killing them. That's pretty much a euphemism for what that was. It's going to be a physical act of violence and aggression. We don't think that that is proportional. They said that they had two arguments on the principle and the practical, but their principal argument was basically we should practically adapt to changing war trends. That seems like a pretty practical argument to me. Their response, they were basically saying we should respond to cyber attacks. So our first response to what was essentially one argument was that they never demonstrated to us the real imperative for using military aggression, which is a huge show of force, against a cyber attack. They really need to do that. But second, they essentially claim that using cyber warfare and existing methods of responding to these attacks increase aggression and escalate the conflict. But what they're proposing is an even larger escalation of the conflict through using literal violence. So if they want to undermine escalation, and we'll tell you exactly how we do this later on in our speech, let's not literally kill perpetuators of cyber attacks. China hacks American banks all the time. Yeah, that leads to stealing money. But what do we think is going to happen when we respond to that militarily? It's going to escalate the conflict even more. If they want to prevent this, I don't understand how they're proposing. But furthermore, they say that essentially existing metrics don't respond fast enough. We think that in the age of increased technology, as they acknowledge, cyber attacks, counterattacks can be pretty effective, and furthermore, the sanctions that we advocate at the top of our speech can be pretty immediate. That's not unique to their side. But finally, they advocate for cutting off the root of these problems. We don't think that, we think that in our world, where we actually increase cyber defense mechanisms and levy cyber attacks against those perpetrators, we do just this, but without overwhelmingly escalating the conflict. Now let's move on into the substantive matter from side opposition. First, their policy is principally unjust. We have two justifications. First, it is inherently not proportional. Why is this so? Why is military aggression more extreme and disproportionate to a cyber attack? First of all, and they brought this up, it's just statistical fact that the vast majority of cyber attacks are used to expose information and at the worst do things like undermine banking services, which affects money. Military aggression is physical. It threatens physical well-being, often leading to infrastructural damage and death and industry. And because this policy necessarily constitutes retaliation, it's probably going to be pretty noticeable and substantial, even if they're going to gloss over this by calling it surgical. We think it is principally unjustified for states to use these overwhelmingly detrimental means of responding to what really doesn't justify this. I'll take you in a moment. Just as we would never advocate the state executing thieves for stealing a loaf of bread, we are not going to advocate for this overwhelmingly disproportionate response. Before I move into the second layer, go.
If North Korea launches an artillery attack on Seoul, is Seoul justified in taking out the place where that artillery attack occurred and the equipment that they used to fire?
That's a huge false comparative, first of all, because we think that undermining someone's banking system is nowhere near as extreme as literally wiping out an entire city. So if preventing like mass annihilation of a population, that's justification for military intervention. Your policy is not. That's just an egregious false comparative. But now let's move on into our second layer under this argument on how this violates the state's responsibility to its citizens. The state's job is to protect the well-being of its people, its civilians, its troops. Why is this so? Obviously, it is just inherently set up to help these people. It's accountable to them, and it is only democratically legitimate if it actually fulfills the will of the people and acts responsibly in their interest. We have an expectation when we elect governments that they're going to use the massive powers that we grant to them responsibly. And at the point where they're responding overwhelmingly disproportionately to military attacks, we think that that responsibility is violated. But furthermore, military aggression often constitutes putting troops on the ground to execute these so-called surgical attacks. We are putting these people in harm's way. What justification does the state have to do that? We don't think they have any. Our second substantive argument in today's debate is on how their side increases conflict in three ways. First, by increasing warmongering. Two justifications under this. First, it legitimizes war hawks in the countries retaliating militarily by validating the narrative that military reactions are a legitimate tool to non-military so-called aggression. This empowers these individuals to push for similar responses in response to non-military aggression. But the second justification under this layer is it obviously is going to infuriate those who are being retaliated against. Why? Obviously, military action is much more extreme and much more viscerally horrifying to the people being attacked than, say, a technological attack on some kind of infrastructure or an economic attack. A physical attack on your well-being is much, much more visceral. This is obviously going to further their narrative of escalating conflict even further, of advocating for pushing back against who they view as an attacker and an oppressor. This is going to lead to more conflict, more escalation, something they want to decrease on their side of the house. Our second layer under this argument is about how this undermines long-term diplomacy and efforts to decrease conflict. In two ways. First, obviously military responses are justified as a first response to these things. But second, we close off future possible engagement diplomatically. For example, the Iran-US nuclear deal probably never would have happened if Iran attacked the US militarily after it launched the Stuxnet attack against Iran's nuclear facilities. That diplomatic pathway never ever could have existed, and that undermines long-term stability. But finally, our last layer under this argument is often military aggression is literally just a declaration of war. When someone attacks the United States, for example, we go to war. That is exactly what they're advocating for on their side of the house. If they want to decrease conflict, decrease escalation, and actually create a principally justified response to cyber attacks, they're going to vote opposition. Thank you.
Previous speaker spent 8 minutes, 24 seconds.
To continue the case of proposition, we call upon Nicholas.
In the summer of 2013, North Korean cyber troops launched a devastating period of cyber attacks on South Korea. What did that mean? That meant that electricity access was cut off for us. That meant the nation's most key financial sectors were cut off. At the point at which you cannot have freedom of movement in your own country because the commute doesn't work, at the point at which your stock market has fallen 500 points, At the point at which you are worried about whether or not your grandfather will survive in the hospital because your hospital's generator has been cut off, and in a few weeks, those backup generators won't work, is at the point at which your civilians are in danger, and that's a heck of an act of war. They tried to paint this in a very glib way. They said, oh my god, your stock market has crashed. That doesn't matter. As long as we don't respond and just have economic sanctions, they magically won't do it. Notice how they aren't telling you that in the status quo, their model is what we are basing our response off of. That cyber attacks are met with either very hasty sanctions that don't do anything, or are met on like one more person's assets being frozen. Notice that if you accept that the status quo is working, team government, team opposition is your team. If you recognize that there isn't being a proportional response, we're on your side. This speech I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to go over the 2 points of contention. Firstly, is it justified? Secondly, which side makes these attacks much less likely? Then I'm going to go into my third argument and directly clash with their argument that it makes escalation a lot more likely by telling you why accidental wars are a lot more likely when troops on the front line don't have communication access to their headquarters. Firstly, is it justified or not? We give you a very clear stance. They tried to really strawman here. They had a lot of strawmans here. We told you that this will be a surgical strike that is proportional to what this attack is. So, for example, if North Korea attacked Sony, that doesn't mean that we're going to launch an all-out nuclear war on North Korea. What it does mean is that we will have a proportional response that military commanders deem necessary. In other words, we will look at what kind of military response is necessary to ensure they can no longer attack those same facilities. We will ensure that we have a military response that prevents them from doing this in the future. I asked it in a point of information, right? If North Korea attacks Seoul with artillery pieces, we are justified in taking out the places from where those attacks originated. We're doing the exact same thing here. We're taking out those places from which those attacks originated. You wouldn't have sanctions because they attacked you like that. Secondly, we told you a very principal argument. We told you that technology is embedded in warfare, that tools are ineffective today. Absolutely no real response other than that there is a real imperative for aggression, that this is going to be a massive, disproportionate response. Notice, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a cyber attack. This means that the perpetrators of that cyber attack are the aggressors that have targeted innocent civilians. What we are doing is we are attacking the military forces that underwent those attacks. That is a proportionate response. Military attacking another military for attacking your civilians is proportional no matter how you try to spin that. Then we told you why oftentimes you prevent cyber attacks from occurring in the first place. So you prevent them from occurring in the first place. I would extend on that and say, if at the point at which the cyber attack is currently ongoing, by taking out those key servers where they base their attacks off of, you prevent that from continuing as well. Then we told you why specific countries are vulnerable, why it attacks civilian and military. Notice they did not have any response to how we told you. Michelle gave you clear analysis on why troops are cut off on the front lines, why this is tantamount to a military attack. At the point at which you are unable to talk to your commanders in your capital, that's the same as a physical cutting off of your telephone cables. That's the same as physically preventing you and destroying your infrastructural capabilities. Absolutely no response on their side. They need a response at that point. They'll be quite late. Then we told you why, in fact, you need an immediate response that is proportional. We told you about how specific civilians die. They tried to paint this as it's not proportional because it's just your banking system. Again, we gave you clear analysis on why civilians die if hospitals aren't functioning, why every single day your economy isn't functioning, is every single day your country isn't able to have the productive capabilities to give your citizens a better standard of living. Second point of contention, why is war a lot less likely? We told you we are living in a society today where there's a very gray area. So cyber warfare is very new. So that means that it's a lot easier for foreign policy for leaders to exploit it. Leaders like Putin love exploiting, in a moment, sir, gray areas where there aren't real legal norms. At the point at which you say a cyber attack is an act of war is at the point at which Putin says, oh, I guess the warfare is really clearly established here. Anything I do will be directly responded. Absolutely no response again. Yes, sir.
What kind of military response doesn't endanger civilian lives?
Could you repeat that point?
What kind of military response doesn't endanger civilian lives?
Well, first of all, I already told you why, in fact, cyber attacks directly endanger civilian lives, talking about hospitals, the ability to communicate with their forces. But also I told you why military strikes are justified and proportional, because they're fighting against the perpetrator. They're the ones that launched the cyber attack on you, not the other way around. Now we told you, their side told you it's warmongering, it legitimizes warmongering, that causes a lot of conflict, why it causes a lot of death. We told you already why military strikes are exactly the same as these cyber attacks, because number one, you kill people, number two, you destroy infrastructure, number three, it disrupts country development. All three of this is both the same for cyber attacks and military strikes. Then they tell you about diplomacy, and I really love this point. The point of US Stuxnex and Iran being all angry, and if Iran had attacked the US, there would not have been this kind of conflict. Number one, I don't think the Iranian general would have thought it a proportional response to attack the United States of America. Number two, diplomacy occurred, whether or not of that military strike. It's not that like Iranian-US relations were really all that cozy before that military strike occurred in the first place. We think that's a completely different response. Then they told you it leads to more escalation. I'm going to directly rebut this in my third argument, where I tell you why you make accidental wars a lot more likely when you attack their military communication infrastructure. Absolutely no response. Thesis of this argument, that you make a full-out war a lot more likely and almost inevitable when you increase the fog of war for a military on the front lines and create the use it or lose it mentality. How is this the case? So 21st century militaries today rely a lot on effective communication with headquarters and communication to prevent accidental wars and provide an extra layer of accountability. So for example, before you shoot at the enemy, you have to check in with your commanders at the capital and make sure, is this okay or not? That's seen along the DMZ in South Korea, that's seen with the US troops in Iraq. The problem is, on their side of the house, their cyber attacks damage this chain of command, especially on the front line. So what that means is you cut off radio systems, you cut off GPS systems, you cut off the ability of the people on the front lines to communicate with the people in HQ. Why is that a massive harm? Now you often have individualized units that are very scared, who are now cut off from their commands and the leaders at the capital city who are able to give you orders. So troops are often on the front lines, very edgy and tense already. Now you make it seem like they don't know what's going on because they literally don't know what's going on. For all they know, the capital has already been attacked. For all they know, the war has already begun and cyber attacks have massively crippled their infrastructure. That's why, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you see that the submarine operator almost started a nuclear war when he was unable to talk to Moscow and get confirmation on what he was supposed to do. Especially when cyber attacks have been intricately linked to warfare today, like how Putin engaged in cyber warfare before invading the Ukraine. It's very likely that a lot of troops are very tense and edgy when they get reports of cyber warfare and are cut off. You make it seem like now, if they don't react with force, perhaps the other side will destroy them before they are able to react, creating the use it or lose it mentality. Either I react very strongly right now and show off my military capability, or I'm never going to be able to use it, so I might as well use it. You make that a lot less likely on our side of the house, because A, cyber attacks are a lot less likely when you create that clear deterrent effect. Number two, cyber attacks are a lot shorter when you're able to cut them off from the very beginning by cutting off the area off of which it originated. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. The escalation of military conflicts occurs when you don't have access to checks and balances. By preventing the destruction of those checks, you prevent the destruction of war. We are so very proud to propose.
The previous speakers had 8 minutes, 21 seconds.
To continue the case of opposition and Congress and DCF.
Russia launches cyber attacks out of a signals intelligence room in the Kremlin. Beijing launches cyber attacks out of a government building in, well, the capital, Beijing. I am confused when side proposition says, well, they don't want to escalate conflicts, but simultaneously, they want to attack the very places that launch these communications, that launch these cyber attacks. Oftentimes, we think those are either government buildings or literally the capitals of these nations. They haven't proven to you why their side of the house actually decreases escalation. 3 things on this speech. First, I'm going to clarify what cyber attacks actually look like, because we think there's been a gross mischaracterization coming out of side government. Then 2 questions on the principle and on the practical, and then our third argument, which unfortunately I found. Okay, so let's talk about the idea of clarifying what cyber attacks actually look like. What they tell you is the idea that states use cyber warfare to kill people. First of all, they never engage with what we tell you in Opposition 1, which is that the overwhelming majority of cyber attacks are these name and shame campaigns, right? But let's go deeply into the incentive structures of cyber hackers. What are their incentive structures in the status quo? For people who attack banks, it's about profit. Like Chinese hackers made off with billions of dollars last year. But for people who attack, look at the Pentagon and steal fighter plane designs, it's about espionage stuff, right? They come to you with this narrative.
Sir.
No, cyber hackers are killing people. Where do we say this is true? This is true in the case of South Korea and North Korea, when you see states that are literally already at war. There is no incentive to kill other countries' citizens unless you are already at war. In that point, we don't see the need of an independent military campaign against those groups in the absence of cyber warfare, right? They give you this argument. Their entire third argument is literally this idea that soldiers are on the battleground and they're fighting against another country that can now use cyber warfare against them. We would already say, insofar that they're engaged with war in that other country, there's no need for a separate independent military campaign, but I'll still four-point their third argument a little later. Let's talk about the principle. What is the principle in this debate? We think it's pretty practical at the point where literally all they're saying is, well, cyber warfare campaigns look a lot like military campaigns. We tell you why that's not true. We tell you the overwhelming majority of cyber warfare campaigns don't actually result in loss of life. What are military campaigns by contrast, right? The narrative here they want to give you is surgical strikes. Let's take perhaps the best possible example of so-called surgical strikes, like American drone strikes in the Middle East still kill literally thousands of civilians even when they're trying to target terrorists. Less than 2% of the people killed in US drone strikes are actually terrorists. I don't know how their side with surgical strikes is somehow going to address the problems that we see with civilian casualties. Moreover, we think that side opposition, our side government, has a special burden in this round at the point where their narrative or their side is literally allowing the murder of civilians who we would say often did not consent to their government's policies. Like, we would really question whether in North Korea the civilians consented towards the policies of the North Korean cyber attacks. We don't think it's justified that you constitute a response upon those civilians at the point where surgical strikes almost always entail surgical civilian casualties, right? They don't really have a principled argument in this round. Let's talk about our principled argument. First, we told you about proportionality. We showed you why the vast majority of cyber attacks didn't actually entail this loss to life. There's no proportionality there. But second, we say you have a state obligation to your people not to get involved in random military campaigns, right? It is principally unjustified for the United States to go to war with China over the banking sector, just like we think it was principally unjustified for the United States to go to war in Iraq for oil, right? Economic motives do not trump the lives, the cost of your citizens. We see those are principally abhorrent. Let's talk about the practical, right? They have two arguments here. First is this idea of deterrence. This is largely contingent on what they tell you in Proposition 1, which is that, quote, all of these people just assume there's no response. First of all, we say our side clearly stands for a response. But second, we say retaliation increases under their side of the house. Why? Because let's be realistic. If Putin cyber attacked the United States responded with a military strike, do they really not think that Putin doesn't respond with a military strike of his own? That's absolutely absurd. They need to engage with their actual stance, which is just more and more military escalation and retaliation. That's why we see conflict increasing on their side of the house. But they have this third argument about accidental warfare. First of all, we would say this doesn't actually exist because they're already in military campaigns. There's no need for a separate independent military campaign, but let's still give 4 points of rebuttal on it. First, you increase the likelihood of accidental warfare when you literally lay down tripwires across your geopolitical strategy, because you're saying every time we respond to you with a cyber attack, we're going to respond to you with a military retaliation, and that's only going to lead to further military retaliation. All this does is increase the risk of accidents. Second, we have a question about what is actually determine a cyber attack. All they tell you is, well, military responders, military commanders to deem an appropriate response. We would say that's extremely vague for their side to come to you with this kind of model. You need to explain what is constituted as a serious cyber attack that they would actually respond to. Otherwise, I would say Anonymous just released the names of some FBI agents, let's go to war. We don't think that's actually justified. But third, we think when you legitimize war, you increase warfare. No real response out of side government other than to say, well, Putin will already engage in war anyway. We think what you do is not in states with leaders like Putin, but in states like the United States, all you do is legitimize war further. But fourth, we think when you increase military engagement, you increase the risk of accidents. Where do we see this? Look to the 2011 attack that NATO had in Pakistan, killing 26 Pakistani soldiers. What that did is it shut down Pakistani supply routes, and they wouldn't help NATO in its logistical exit from the war. That's why we think we're massively ahead on the practical in this round. We tell you why to increase escalation on their side of the house. Let's go to our third argument about
Sir.
increased anti-state sentiment. Yes?
Could you give me a single example of an economic sanction that has stopped a cyber attack?
Okay, so first of all, I would tell you that targeted sanctions against Vladimir Putin have massively decreased the number of cyber attacks. Second, I would tell you that in the United States, when the United States levied sanctions against Iran, because the United States wanted to seek a nuclear arrangement, that was far more preferable to military strikes. Let's go in on anti-state sentiment, right? This argument is going to take their case at its best. It's going to basically say, okay, let's say you only use it in the most dire of circumstances. Why does anti-state sentiment still increase, and why is that bad? First, we think sentiment directed at the retaliating state increases. Why? We tell you, military engagement increases civilian casualties. We think this is inevitable in every military conflict, even with surgical strikes, but especially it's evident when you retaliate against non-state actors, right? In Proposition 1, they literally tell you fringe groups are also doing cyber attacks, but they never engage with a part of the motion that they themselves run up, right? We think these non-state actors exist in civilian populations and have ties to civilian populations. So when you attack those people, you increase civilian casualties, and this increases anti-state sentiment. First, because people feel their own government can't protect them, but second, people feel the government, people feel more hatred for the government that actually attacked them. They're far more likely to attack to join radical groups. But second, we think this increased anti-state sentiment that is directed against the cyber-attacking states. Military engagement feeds narratives of state superiority. For example, when the United States invaded Iraq, they decided to call Iraqis ragheads because that made it easier to dehumanize the enemy and to target the enemy. Overt state action in Iraq also legitimized hate against Iraqis and minority groups. So in first, what do we tell them? We told you that new leaders get elected. This happens when you justify war, but it especially happens because these leaders prey on people's fear of minorities. So not only do you increase conflict, you increase conflict against states that are culturally dissimilar from you. We think this is both principally and practically abhorrent. We think government needs to respond to all of these and a lot more if they hope to take this round.
Previous speakers back 8 minutes, 19 seconds.
To continue the case of proposition, we call upon Lee Ju-han.
It is important to recognize that most of the harms that they bring you are not exclusive. They want to talk about things like animosity, anti-government sentiment. We think that these are problems that are going to inherently exist on both sides, so long as there's a cyber attack, so long as there's a conflict between the two nations, or whatever it may be. What they have to do in today's debate is to tell us the exclusive harms of cyber attacks, exclusive harms of military retaliation, and tell us why that's going to be harmful. Insofar as this debate has happened, they have not done so. I'm going to talk about two clashes in this debate. Firstly, about the principle. Secondly, about the impact. Very simple. Firstly, for principle. Their leader of opposition basically said, oh, we oppose because it's not proportional. Where our Prime Minister has already explained to you why cyber attacks have a harm both on the civilian and the military. They have simply underplayed our characterization and said, no, that doesn't happen. That is not engagement, Mr. Madam Speaker. They need to give us a response and a realistic picture of what this looks like.
Sure.
We furthermore told you why this is oftentimes a reason for warfare in the status quo. That is, we think that at the point that a civilian dies in another country, at the point that a soldier has been killed in another country, oftentimes that is a legitimate reason in the status quo for war. They have not proved to us why it should be different simply because it was a cyber attack. And notice that the leader of opposition has said, directly quoting, if someone attacks your country, you go to war. We think that that is something that we stand for. Of course we stand for proportionality and we stand for this as a choice, but we don't think they engage with us on principle. But when we talk about proportionality, we don't simply have to compare care about the impact, we have to talk about the target. And recognize that their alternative was things like sanctions, things like cyber attacking the other country, things like having cyber defense systems. Notice that these are oftentimes things that harm the civilians of another country, not the direct perpetrators of an attack. We think we provide a world in which military retaliation is by intention something that is going to deal with the perpetrator. And then they say, no, military retaliation harms civilians too. Look, the intention is different. Of course, military retaliation oftentimes harms civilians, but we think that at the point that they are the side that harms civilians by purpose, and they're the side that does it much, much more, we think that's the comparative that we should be looking at. But then again, they said, even like they then just tried to distort the characterization of cyber attacks and said, look, it's usually about information. Even if we take them at their best, we don't think that they respond to the characterization and model we gave you. First of all, we told you about proportionality, and that states can use this as an option if they feel like their state has been threatened as a result of the cyber attack. Secondly, they have never told us as to how an economic sanction or cyber defense system is going to prevent this information from leaking. But thirdly, and most importantly, we would say that recognize that information is very important in the status quo. We think that a leakage of information actually means that it can lead to actual deaths in the country. We think it means that it can lead to civilians being harmed. Why is that the case? Because oftentimes when your information is leaked, that means that you can't have that means that oftentimes military can't operate properly. That means that the military has to change tactics in order to isolate certain soldiers. We think that is a direct attack on your military. But secondly, even in terms of civilians, we think that at the point that information has been leaked, now the other country has the incentive and the bargaining power to use that information in whatever way you want. And we think this is a direct harm on your citizenry. We think countries have an obligation to respond to that. Of course, oftentimes the countries that carry out cyber attacks will deny that it had any impact on the civilians, but we are the side that clearly characterized to you what that impact is about. We told you from the Prime Minister's speech, they still have not engaged with our characterization. Secondly, let's talk about impacts. And they were willing to hinge this debate on mostly the escalation of conflict. Recognize that they have never engaged with Michelle's characterization about the calculus of people who carry out cyber attacks. We think that people carry out cyber attacks not simply because they're bored, but because they recognize that there is no retaliation and there is no particular response that is going to happen. Look, in the status quo, of course there's economic sanctions, of course there's cyber defense systems that are being strengthened, but this is why countries oftentimes don't stop. Because oftentimes leaders see that that's not going to result in your soldiers dying, it's not going to result in your military being harmed in any kind of way, and we think that a military retaliation is oftentimes the weakness of those particular countries where they feel the most vulnerable. They have failed to engage with how status quo actually works. But in the case in which we gave you the calculus of these leaders and how that's going to change, they have simply said, no, that's not true. We don't think that's enough for them to take this debate. But even if a war were to happen or a tension were to take place, we think at that point that war is happening, it is a war that would have happened regardless of whether that military retaliation had been there or not. Because what does it mean when a country is willing to have a war as a result of your military retaliation when they're the country that had the cyber attack in the first place? It means that they are willing to attack you no matter what the pushback is. And we have proven to you why we've changed the calculus of individuals who are willing to respond differently, but they have not engaged with us and told us why they would support a world in which that war would not have happened. Yes?
The only time states kill each other's citizens in cyber attacks is if they're already at war. Those are your examples. What then justifies an independent military campaign?
We think that that is not the only instances. Yes, of course, the perpetrators of cyber attacks will say, we haven't killed your civilians, but we think that the consequences oftentimes means that your civilians have died. Of course, if there's simply a cut in electricity, the other country can say, oh, we have not killed your civilians, so it is okay. But we have clearly illustrated to you why information matters, why civilians are impacted as a result of that, and even if civilians don't die as a result of that, at the point that civilians feel unsafe and insecure, we think it is in the right, I am responding to your POI, we think it is in the right of these countries to protect, to make sure that its citizens feel safer. Moving on, even if a war were to happen, we told you that that's something that would have happened anyway, because it means that the leader does not care about your pushback. But in the instances in which wars happen, we think we are the side that deals with that war better. Why is that the case? Because we still guarantee a more effective and faster win to the war. We gave you the example of how Putin carried out cyber attacks on Ukraine before actually militarily invading Ukraine. We think it would have been better for Ukraine had they sent soldiers before that. Oftentimes we think we are defending a status quo in which these countries are either aggressors, and we think that in those two case scenarios, we are the side that gives you a better response to them. But secondly, we also talked about deterrence. Notice that they have not necessarily responded to the idea that these countries are much less likely to attack in terms of cyber warfare if there is a direct consequence as a result of that. They are the side that also agreed that cyber warfare is something that is bad. If that is the case, they need to tell us how they prevent it better on their side. And then they talk about things like diplomacy. We don't think that economic sanctions or having other countries' cyber attacks are any better at dealing with diplomacy. The thing is, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we have to recognize that diplomacy is fractured on both sides. Whereas that is the case, we are the side that told you why it is much more better in dealing with these kinds of problems, much better in making sure that problems like cyber attacks never occur again in the future because there's a direct consequence on your country that is explicit and something that you can see. We think that that is why we take the debate. Thank you.
Previous speakers spent 8 minutes, 13 seconds.
To continue the case of opposition, we call upon Ali.
What did Proposition 3 just say? When people feel unsafe, the government has the right to go to war. That's a little extreme. I think that sounds exactly like the rush to war mentality we've been talking about down the bench. That is not exactly a justification to bomb another nation or to kill their civilians. We think that's a little bit much. We'll explain more throughout our important points. A few things in this speech. First, I'll talk really quickly about their model, then I'll delve into the comparative of both worlds, then talk about two key areas of clash. First, which side is principally correct? Second, which side prevents conflict and war in the long run? Really quickly on their model. As nice as it sounds, there are still a few questions that they refuse to answer. Like, first of all, what does a surgical intervention actually look like? We tell you that things countries define as surgical interventions, such as drone strikes, do actually practically kill civilians, especially since, as Aditya tells you, often these routes that they want to attack are in huge population centers or government buildings. They refuse to engage with that. It's a little late to do it now. But furthermore, we tell you it can easily be an excuse to rush to war anyways. That's something they have to engage with. So, what is the comparative in today's round? Let's start with what their world looks like. We tell you, in their world, it's much too easy for a state to pull the trigger and launch into an all-out war. What's one of the reasons we tell you about? We tell you, you see increased anti-state sentiment. This is the third argument that Aditya brings you. No engagement from side government. 3 reasons that's true. First of all, because when you militarily attack another country for a cyber attack, the people never consented to. Those people feel that their government put them at risk. But second, because you're much more likely to see hatred of other governments when they are attacking you, again, for something your government did and you didn't. But third, because it perpetuates this notion of state superiority when you launch a disproportionate response to a cyber attack. Inevitably, that leads to more violence. When you have more hatred, when you have more aggression in the international sphere, you see more of that in the long run. We say you increase war, including cyber attacks, when you allow all violence to happen with a hair trigger. But what do we tell you? We tell you that yes, we do respond directly, but we do it without actually, launching into a war. What do they say? They say, we believe we should take out the problem of cyber attacks at the root. A couple of problems there. First of all, cyber defense literally does that. If you cannot break a cyber defense, the problem is solved. But second, if they want a proportionate immediate response, a good way to do that sounds like launching another cyber attack to destroy those operations. That doesn't kill anybody like a drone strike does. We achieve the same result of shutting down the base, but we don't actually risk lives in the process. That's why we believe looking at the comparative is really important. Them making fun of us and saying, I don't know what cyber defense does, is not amounting to engagement. So, first core area of clash in today's round, which side is principally correct? What do we bring to you? First, we tell you an argument about proportionality. We tell you, in general, it is factually correct. Most cyber attacks are low-level attacks just about exposing information because, frankly, that's just what most actors are capable of. But let's take them at their highest ground and say, yes, there are a lot of attacks that do things like take out hospitals. We'll use their own example. We'd say, first of all, the people of the nation that is often committing that attack do not consent to it in the first place. Therefore, they do not deserve to be punished for it. That means when there is a strike and they die in the process, that is still not proportionate. But second, going back to their example, do you seriously think it would be better for South Korea to declare war on North Korea for this attack than for, say, China to join the sanctions regime that isn't working? We would say declaring war is never the solution. We think that would just lead to way more escalation on their side of the bench. But furthermore, as Aditya says in a POI and in Proposition 2, there is absolutely no way that you do not risk civilian lives on your side of the house. These civilians are not all collectively responsible for these cyber attacks. They should not be part of a collective punishment. But the next layer of our principle that we bring to you, and again, we extend across the bench, is the idea of state responsibility. They never engage with this. We tell you, states have responsibilities to their very own people to not put them at risk, to not send them into an unnecessary war. When you send people into wars that are not warranted, you bite into this principle and the state is neglecting its duty to its people. What is the principle they give to you? They tell you that warfare is changing. Yes, we recognize that's true, but just because warfare is changing doesn't mean we should respond to it with, again, violent conventional warfare. We think we should use more modern targeted forms of warfare like improving cyber defense, having a retaliatory cyber attack, or super targeted sanctions. But we would tell you, at the next part of their principle, when they tell you we need an immediate response, and we need a proportionate response, we would tell you our side of the house achieves this better, because things like cyber attacks, defense, and targeted sanctions don't hurt entire swaths of the population. Instead, they found a more direct form of deterrence that does not hurt civilian lives. That is why we push this principle across the bench. But then, the second key area of clash in today's round is which side best prevents conflict. They bring to you an argument about accidental war. Aditya spends a lot of time on this. Let's go through why it's important again. First of all, you increase the likelihood of accidental war when you essentially set a tripwire for the international community to just spill over, when this can become an excuse for war at any minute, when any cyber attack can be a reason a general says, all right, everybody, let's get out the airstrikes. That's when you're more likely to see an accidental war occur. But second, you make war seem like a more legitimate first option when you implement the propositions policy, because instead of engaging in things like diplomacy, which we tell you happen with the United States and Iran, something they just laugh at without actually responding to, you make war seem a lot easier and thus make war a lot more likely. But third, when you're literally sending a military response to a country in response to a cyber attack, of course you're going to have more accidents. More accidents happen when you see more military engagement. But furthermore, why do we tell you their side of the house independently increases conflict? So the first reason we tell you is because you embolden war hawks on their side of the house, because you give them a very, very, very easy excuse to attack another country that they don't necessarily like. But second, and crucially, we tell you, you decrease the likelihood of diplomacy because you make militarism a really easy first option. We think in most scenarios, it's possible for countries to come to an agreement and end violence. End the problem here. We think that this is a really important argument, that contracted peace is always more effective than a military response. Yes?
For a country like Russia, who already has sanctions on them, what keeps them from conducting another cyber attack?
I mean, as Aditya told you, Russian cyber attacks have significantly decreased since the implementation of sanctions. However, even when they made, essentially, when they directly invaded Ukraine without sanctions, we would say that being warlike didn't stop them. Sanctions are the only thing that has actually been effective. But third, we tell you it's literally a declaration of war. We would say that most of the cyber attacks we are talking about do not amount to that level. We do not believe that a violent military response is proportionate. Rather, we believe it continues conflict in the long run. What do they bring to you? Deterrence. Their only reason this is true is because they believe that without retaliation, this problem still exists. We would tell you things like sanctions and cyber attacks in response do amount to retaliation. We can do this on our side of the house. But second, you increase cyber attacks in the long run on their side of the house, because when you see more conflict, when you see more resentment between countries, you create more of a motivation for those countries to engage in things like cyber warfare. But third, we believe there would also be more cyber attacks in response to this military incursion. reason their deterrence falls, but take them at their highest ground. Say deterrence is true. That is not just. Punishing civilians with death, with destabilization, is not worth the cost of what most cyber attacks bear, and thus we are proud to oppose.
Previous speaker's time, 8 minutes, 6 seconds.
To close the case of opposition, we call upon Ella.
The crux of the proposition case is that preventing cyber attacks is really good. The problem arises, though, when their mechanism to do this is not justified. Military intervention demands a massive imperative on their side of the house. They don't prove it. And furthermore, their mechanism actively harms the very individuals that they are trying to protect. At the point where they think that Ukraine should invade Russia in response to a cyber attack, and that is going to help civilians, is the point where they lose this debate outright. 2 questions in this speech. First, which side is best on principle, and then which side is best on practical. They're really behind on this question of principle, because at the point where they say that undermining banking systems and electricity infrastructures is justified then in leading to a response where we literally kill civilians through so-called surgical strikes is seriously unjust. We tell you that these civilians who are going to be casualties from these so-called surgical strikes do not deserve to be punished for the actions of their government. That response is not proportionate, and there are other ways to undermine cybersecurity infrastructure that don't lead to these immense negative externalities. But the only principle that they maybe have standing at the end of the ground is this interesting idea they bring up in the 3rd speech, where they say the difference between their side and ours is that they don't mean to hurt civilians, but sanctions do. I'm sorry, when has "I didn't mean to kill a civilian" been a legitimate justification for killing a civilian? It is not. That is still an overwhelmingly disproportionate response. But now let's move into the practical, because that's where the crux of this debate lies. The goal on both sides of the House was essentially to protect civilians, and their best argument in this round is that if we cut off cyber attacks through military intervention and maybe prevent them by increasing the threat, that's going to be really good. It's going to help our economy and make sure that hospitals have generators so that people can actually live. We told you that there are other ways to achieve the means that they propose, things like sanctions, which have empirically decreased the amount of cyber attacks that Russia provides. Cyber infrastructure attacks that decrease these nations and Nazi actors' ability to perpetuate the attacks that they so condemn. But let's take them at their very best. Military intervention is the only way to decrease cyber attacks, and that's what they advocate for. That comes at a massive, massive cost. Because yes, conflict may exist on both sides. The difference is, on our side of the House, it is mostly conflict in the cybersphere. On their side of the House, it is concrete military aggression. Inadequate responses to all of the analysis that we bring you about why this is true, about how this fuels warmongering and justifies military responses that endanger civilian lives, that this undermines diplomatic channels that we tell you about, that they really don't dispute, that increase conflict in the long term and eliminate diplomatic engagement as a means to resolve this before it gets really bad. The third argument we bring you that they do not engage with, about increasing anti-state sentiment, instability, and conflict for civilians. And finally, conflict often literally means a declaration of war. Should we attack North Korea because they launched a cyber attack on us? Should we attack China because they undermined our banking infrastructure? Should Ukraine have invaded Russia when they perpetuated a cyber attack against it? Absolutely not, because the response is literal war that leads to civilian casualties, not just the nuisance of not having electricity and not having a banking infrastructure. That is the biggest impact in today's round, something their side indisputably causes, and is the largest reason why you have to sign a ballot for the opposition. We don't believe in sacrificing civilian lives so that we can prevent a cyber attack, though we dispute that they even didn't do that on their side of the house. That is why we are so proud to oppose.
Previous speaker spent 4 minutes, 7 seconds.
To close the debate, we call upon Nicholas.
Ready? The problem on team opposition today is that they gave you enough straw man to fill like the rice fields of Bali, right? Here from their side of the house, we heard, like, you guys are gonna start nuclear war. You guys are gonna attack Moscow. You guys are gonna attack like Beijing, and you're gonna start a nuclear war. How many times do we have to tell you proportional response that the generals come up with for you to understand we're not suggesting a direct strike on Moscow, that we're not suggesting infringing upon the US Constitution and launching military strikes on our own civilians? How many times do we have to tell you proportional and attacking areas where military operations are taking place? Do you have to understand that we're talking about entirely different worlds here? We think they fail to understand that, and that's why we've taken this debate. In this speech, I'm going to go over the 4 really big straw men that they went over in their side of the house. Firstly, we told you who are the actual people that launched these attacks. They tried to paint today that these individuals are innocent victims, just individuals that North Korea flogged and whipped until they launched a denial of service attack on South Korea. No, we told you very clearly a broad, nuanced characterization on why these are not innocent civilians. These are military officials, military people, military soldiers that were trained by North Korea to attack the civilian infrastructure and military infrastructure of South Korea. Again, no response on their side. We told you why they oftentimes attack civilian infrastructure and often attack military people. The only real response we ever heard was, it's going to attack greedy Wall Streeters, so who cares if a few banks go under? No, they never ever engaged the massive amount of analysis we told you, the national trauma you have when your hospitals go down, when you are unable to commute from work to home, when you are unable to feel like a citizen of your own country because another country is constantly attacking and launching at you millions of lines of malicious code that fail to have any impact on the ability of you to live your life peacefully. Again, no real response other than the banks bank the banks. We don't like banks, we get it, but we don't think that's sufficient of a response. Secondly, which side limits escalation and war? We told you firstly, at the point at which you make it a lot less likely that war occurs and these cyber attacks occur is at the point we already run. But even if they continue occurring, we told you about our third argument, and this was a really big straw man, which I'm really disappointed because I worked really hard on my third argument. I told you my third argument, why even when war hasn't occurred yet, why you increase the escalation and the possibility of war when these troops are cut off from the front lines. The only thing they said is war has already occurred. No, war hasn't already occurred. You make it a lot more likely to occur when those individual troops don't know what's going on and make it feel like they actually have to attack. Again, no response, yet you pointed this out. Then, which side prevents these cyber attacks from occurring? Given that there's a massive harm of these actual cyber attacks, which side prevents it? The only thing they told you is economic sanctions, economic sanctions. Like, I really don't know if they really think that Kim Jong-un will go mamma mia when he sees that another economic sanctions been placed on his country. Both of our countries should know Kim Jong-un doesn't really care about economic sanctions. The notion he does is just ridiculous. We told you a proportional response. So like military operations against non-innocent military combatants, whether it be covert or overt, whether it be specifically attacking the servers off of which they created those attacks. Again, the only thing we heard was nuclear war with Russia, nuclear war with North Korea. Not what we told you. We told you a proportional response, whether it be covert, overt, on the specific areas that conducted those strikes. No response. They want to engage with their strawman analysis. They want to engage with their broad characterization that is very narrow. Again, no response. Then they told you about anti-state sentiment. They said Yeju didn't respond to that. Yeju got really angry. She really did respond to that, right? So she told you why anti-state sentiment is not exclusive. Why actually sanctions create that sentiment a lot more. It turns out sanctions attack civilians versus military surgical strikes that attack non-innocent, guilty people who launched those attacks. It turns out that when you actually, they told you, civilians don't deserve to be affected by what their government does. Then why do you even place sanctions on it in the first place, right? At the point at which the government has created an active attack on your nation, launched millions of lines of malicious code at you, we take this debate. At the end of the day, ask yourself a question, are cyber attacks destructive? Number 2, which side stops cyber attacks? We've taken both of those questions. We are incredibly proud to propose.